Hi there folks, and welcome back to another GI Racing 2 Game Developer Diary brought to you by the Game Institute. I'm Gary Simmons, and in this video I'm going to talk about something that isn't really specific to racing games at all and is applicable to games of all genres, and that's how I implemented the mini-map in GI Racing 2. Now, I've been an instructor at Game Institute for many years, and I've literally lost count the number of times that I've received emails from students asking for tips and tricks on how to implement a mini-map in either their RPG game or their first-person shooter game. So we're going to see how you can do that in this lesson and how I used Unity's render texture functionality to make it a reality. So before we go any further, let me press play so we're reminded what my little mini-map looks like in GI Racing 2. I've very much given it the style of a sat-nav. You know, it's very simple, it's very monochrome, it only really renders the track and the cars, and it serves the purpose of allowing the driver to see clutter-free when bends are coming up in the distance. So it really aids them if they don't know the track very well to know when bends are coming up and when they should start braking. I should just say that if the frame rate seems a little low here, that's just due to the video capture software that I'm using to record this particular lesson, so don't worry, this isn't the frame rate typical when you're playing the actual game. Also, you're reminded that if you press the C key and change to a different camera, our sat-nav and our rear view mirrors actually have to work in two different modes. In the cockpit mode, hang on, let me just go back to it. In the cockpit mode, we can see that the mini-map is actually rendered as part of the cockpit polygons. You can see it's actually a texture that is mapped to the cockpit. But when we go to one of the other views, we can see that the mini-map is now rendered. Actually, let me just turn off the rear view mirror by pressing F1. We can see that the mini-map is rendered as an overlay, and it also has a little kind of border rendered around it. So we're going to talk about how we did that. So what is a mini-map? Well, basically it's just a top-down render of the scene, at least the scene in some shape or form. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the video here, and I'm going to kind of undo my mini-map and just wind it all the way back to just being a basic camera. And then I'll show you the steps that I had to take to turn it into that particular representation of the scene. Okay, so first of all, let me draw the attention to the fact that in our scene, we have this mini-map camera. And we also have, of course, our camera manager. And you're reminded, if you haven't watched the GI Racing 1 videos where I show how to set up the camera system, you should probably do that before going any further. The point being is that the camera manager is responsible for understanding which of the cars is the current focus car. Now, during a normal human-controlled race, the focus car of every camera in the scene, be it the cockpit cam, the bonnet cam, the orbit cam, an aerial cam, is always going to be the car that the player is driving. But with a cinematic sequence, it's not so simple. If we look at the main menu in GI Racing 2, for example, there's always a race that is being performed by just AI cars, and we constantly change the cameras so that at one point we might be in the cockpit of one car and then we skip to the cockpit of another car. And of course, when we do that, we need to make sure that whatever mini-map camera we're using to render the scene from top down, it has to move to the correct car and map to that car's cockpit so that we are seeing exactly what that car should be seeing in its mini-map. So we do that using the camera manager, and we have this mini-map camera in the scene. At the moment, this is just a straightforward standard camera, okay? And we'll change it in a minute. In fact, if I open up my managed cameras list, which is all the cameras currently being used by the scene, and turn off my dolly cam, and then turn on my mini-map cam, you can see that there in the scene is currently the position of our mini-map camera. It's just placed, you can see it's just placed in the middle of nowhere at the moment. But when the race starts, the camera manager will find out which car currently has focus and will move the minimap camera to that location. So in order to do that, our camera manager needs to store a reference to the minimap camera. So you can see, if I select the camera manager and I scroll down to the bottom of its inspector, you can see there is a slot there for both the rear view mirror camera and our minimap camera. So that means that when the changes happen between one camera and the next, the camera manager can notify the the minimap cam, and if we select the minimap cam, you can see that there is a GI minimap cam script attached to it, and it's that script that the camera manager is going to talk to, and it's going to call a function called setActor, and that's going to pass in a reference to the car which is currently the focus car of the camera system. And if we open up the GI minimap cam, we can see that all the setActor does is it simply searches the actor that is passed. Remember, the actor is just a game object, it's one of our cars, and it's going to search its hierarchy for a child game object called camera mount -minimap. And if we open up the hierarchies of all of our cars, you can see that every single one of them has a camera mount called camera mount minimap, and this is basically a game object which is positioned on top of the car but way up in the air and is looking down on the car. And every car in our scene, every prefab of every car, has this mount, so that when, for example, in this case we're looking at car VE11, which is this car here, we know that when this car gets the focus of the camera system, that we're going to pass this game object to the minimap camera, and the minimap camera is going to search the hierarchy. It's going to find this mount here, and if we look back at the minimap script again, you can see that it simply, in its update function, makes sure that its position and rotation, remember that's the position and the rotation of the minimap camera, is always perfectly in sync with the position and the rotation of that camera mount. And if we look up in the sky, we should see that, there it is, it's up there, right up there in the sky looking down on the scene. So if you look in the game view now, you can see what the minimap camera can see. Now it's not positioned above the car yet because we haven't pressed play, but at the moment it's just wherever we position it in the scene. And you can see that if I grab the minimap cam and start moving it around, you know, we can imagine how we'd get roughly the effect we want if we mounted it to a car, and as the car was driving around the track, it was dragging that camera with it from way up in the sky. However, we don't want our minimap camera to render to the screen, because that's where our proper camera is going to be rendering. If we were in our cockpit mode, for example, we want to see out the window. We don't want the entire screen to be filled up with what the minimap camera can see. So what we need to do is we need to tell Unity that we don't want our minimap camera to render each frame to the screen, but instead we wish it to render to a texture. If we know that we have a texture that has been created as an asset in our project, that minimap camera is rendering to each frame to keep it up to date as the minimap camera moves around the level, then we know that we can create a material with that texture, and we can map that material just like any other material to any of the polygons on our cockpit. And that's exactly what we've done in this game. We've created a render texture, we've created a minimap material that uses that render texture as its albedo texture, and then we just simply drag and drop that material onto the polygons of our little sat-nav device on our cockpit. So let's see how we create a render texture. Now I've created the render textures already. If you open up Game Institute folder in the project view, you'll see there's a folder there called render textures, and you can see we have two render textures that have been created as assets of this project. We have the one that's being used by the minimap cam, and you can see even now that minimap cam is rendering to that texture, even though it's you know, I'm just selecting it in the project view. And you can also see that if I select the rear view mirror cam, we're also seeing that the rear view mirror cam is also rendering to its own render texture, and that's what we use to map to the mirror surfaces of our car. But we'll talk about that in another lesson. So going back to our render texture, how do we create one if I didn't have it already? Simple. We just right click in the project view, we choose create from the context menu, and then we choose to create a render texture. In my case, I've called it minimap render texture, and I've set the size to be 256 by 256. I don't need this to be a big texture because it's never really going to be taking up a lot of space on screen. It's pretty small when it's on the cockpit, and even in overlay mode it's not much bigger. So 256 by 256 is plenty. Now we can see at the moment that, like I said, our minimap cam hasn't been assigned this render texture, so it's rendering to the screen. But if I select our camera, actually let me bring up the project view, then select the minimap camera, and we take our minimap render texture and we drag that into the target texture slot of our camera component, well, first of all, you can see I'm now getting an error in the game view because I now have no cameras that are rendering to the screen buffer. Remember, I turned them all off so that I could show the minimap camera rendering, but the minimap is no longer rendering to the full screen. It's rendering to that render texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my managed cameras and I'm going to turn back on one of my scene cameras to make that error go away. So if I press play now, what we're going to have is fundamentally the start of our minimap camera system. So I press play. If you look in the cockpit now, we're actually getting a full scene render from our minimap cam. And it actually looks really cool. And in fact, you might say it looks graphically nicer than the minimap that I decided to implement that was very simplistic and monochrome. But the problem with rendering the scene in its entirety like this is, first of all, obviously there's a performance issue. We're causing another render of all of the objects in the scene, which may not be what we want. But also it doesn't really serve its purpose. You see, in order for the minimap to be useful, we need it to be high enough up in the sky such that it fits enough of the tracking up ahead so that we can see corners that are coming up way ahead in the distance. And if you look in the minimap cam now, let me go to another mode here so you can see it. I'll go to overlay mode. You can see that while it looks cool, you can barely see the cars on the track. You can barely actually make out where the track is because it just gets lost in the clutter of all of the other scene objects. So there's two things that we can do to address this. The first thing we're going to do is we're not going to use a perspective camera, we're going to use an orthographic camera. Okay, so let me stop the project for just a moment, stop it running, and from the camera component of my minimap cam, oops, I've got the wrong camera selected. Let me choose my minimap cam, and I'm going to make sure that orthographic is chosen. Actually, orthographic was selected already. In fact, if I put it on perspective mode, you'll see what that looks like. Might not look that much different at the moment, but if I go to overlay mode, you'll see that in perspective mode it's definitely not what we want, because tall buildings actually end up looking closer to the camera, and if we start going past skyscrapers and office blocks and big towering bridges, they're going to almost come right up and almost like clip the front plane of the minimap cam. You can see here that as we go past these buildings, it looks pretty cool actually. You can see they look much closer to the camera. We can see the perspective in the scene, but of course it's not what we want from a minimap. So I'm going to put that back to orthographic, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find a way so that I can only highlight the bits in the scene that I want, because I'm rendering way too much at the moment. All I really want to see is the cars and the track, and I want to see the cars and the track in a much clearer way. We saw when I looked at the minimap just now that from how far up we are in the sky, the cars are tiny, so we need to make them much bigger. So how do I do that? Well, first of all, we can utilize Unity's layer system, because we know that all of the cameras in Unity allow us to specify a culling mask. In other words, it allows us to tell a camera that we only wish it to render certain layers of the scene. Therefore, what we can do is we can create a special minimap layer, and we can only put the things on that layer that we want to be rendered in the minimap, and that allows us to get rid of all the clutter. And you'll notice that if we go to my layers drop down, I do indeed have a minimap layer. So what do I put on the minimap layer? Well, actually, if you look in the scene view now, I don't put any of the stuff you currently see on the minimap layer. In fact, if we open up the Long Beach racetrack game object in the hierarchy, you'll see that if we scroll down to the bottom here, we have a game object called minimap mesh. Now, it may not be immediately obvious at the moment because I've turned off the minimap layer in the scene view. But what this is it's a duplicate copy, really, of the racing line that the drivers take when racing around the track. You can see it highlighted in blue here. Now, what I do is I make a duplicate of this, and then I assign a different material to it. And if you look in the inspector, when I select this minimap mesh, you can see that what I've done is I've assigned it this really garish sort of black and orange striped texture. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to really emphasize the edges of the track so that they show up from a long way up by making them this very big, thick orange color. So why can't we see it in the scene view? Well, the reason we can't see it in the scene view is because I've turned off that layer in the scene view. So if we go to the editor layers drop down, now remember that isn't the layers drop down on an individual game object, but above that in Unity you have another layers drop down, and that allows us to turn off all of the layers that show up in the scene view. And you can see at the moment that I've got the eyes active for almost everything except the minimap layer. If I turn on the minimap layer, hey, there is that duplicate copy of the mesh. Pretty cool stuff, huh? If we go back to our sort of top-down view again, I'll just do it in the scene view. You're starting to see now kind of what the minimap can see, right? And it works pretty well. Now what I do is I decide to put that track just on the minimap layer and nothing else, which means all the minimap camera is going to render is just those black and orange lines that form the shape of the track. And as you can see, the minimap mesh is assigned to the minimap layer. If I was to press play right now, because our minimap cam hasn't been told to render the minimap layer, you can see it's just rendering as it did before. But if we select our minimap cam, in fact, if we wanted to, we could tell it to render the minimap layer on top of the scene that's already there. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it's not too bad. It certainly emphasizes the track, so you could decide to go that way if you wanted, but I still think it looks a bit cluttered. So what I do is I tell the minimap cam that I don't want it to render everything, I want it to render nothing, and then just enable the minimap layer. And if you look in the camera preview here, you can see the difference that that made. So before I had it rendering everything, turn it off, now I'm just going to have it rendering the minimap. So that allows us to see the track. But what about the cars? Now we saw just now that when we were looking through the minimap view, the camera was so far away from the cars that the cars were just little dots. Therefore, in order to get them to show up in the minimap cam, I was going to need to really over-exaggerate their size. And here is how we do it. Now, bear in mind that I've got the minimap layer still active in the scene view, and you can see when I look at the cars here, look what they look like. That's why I have to turn off the minimap layer in the scene view, because it becomes a little hard to work with. So let me just turn off the minimap layer in the scene view for just a moment so we can see our cars again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of those cars, then I'm going to hit the select from its inspector to show its prefab in the project view. And you'll notice, and we saw this a little bit in the last lesson, that when we select a car and see what was imported, what we get is we get this car with this great big orange disc above it. Now, as you can imagine, what I've actually done is, as I created all of my car prefabs, and let me just open up a car here, you'll see that what I did is I created a massive quad above the car. See if you can see it here. You can kind of see it. Can you see it there? It's kind of highlighted in blue here, like that. And I've mapped this texture to it. I call it the minimap token non-focus. There's also a focus one, which is white. And that's the white material is going to be used when it's the actual to indicate the player's car on the minimap, and the orange one is going to be used to show every other car on the minimap. So the point here is that in order to get my cars to show up on the minimap, I'm going to add a massive quad above them, acting like a huge canopy. I'm going to map to this quad this transparent circle texture, which I call the token. But that game object too, that minimap token, which remember every car has as part of the car hierarchy, is also assigned to the minimap layer. So this will only be seen by the minimap, just like our minimap duplicate of the track. And once again, if I pull down the layers for the scene view and enable the minimap layer in the scene view, you can see now that all of the cars on our starting grid have one of these really massive quads as part of its hierarchy with this sort of transparent texture map to it. And of course, as we start to sort of pull back the scene view and we start to get something that looks a little bit more like what the minimap camera will look like, you can see that even from way up in the sky now, if we're rendering, just the minimap layer, then we're going to see the cars where we wouldn't ordinarily see them. We can see those great big tokens, but the actual cars from this distance would be very, very small indeed. Now, to be fair, I needn't have made a separate copy of the track polygons for the minimap. I suppose I could have done something maybe a little bit fancy, and just as we're about to render the minimap camera, I could have swapped the material over on the base track, but I didn't really want to do that. And the reason I have a separate copy of the track is that the minimap track is actually much more lowly tessellated than the track that is used in the game. So if I actually use the same track, although it would appear as if I was essentially sort of saving performance by not having two tracks, I would actually be losing performance because I would be rendering a much highly tessellated track in the minimap where it just isn't warranted. And press play now. We should just see on our sat nav the track and our great big tokens. So that's all that's happening. We're just rendering it from above, and we're just filtering out all of the objects we don't need, and we're using those quads to overemphasize the size of the cars. So of course, once we've got a render texture, if we wish to map it to any of the polygons in the scene, we just need to create a material from it. So if I go down into my Game Institute folder, into my render textures folder, and I choose my mini map cam material, you can see that this is just a standard unlit material that I have just dragged my my minimap texture into. And then once I've got this material, I can then drag and drop that onto the polygons of my high-res cockpit. And just to show you what I mean, if I open up one of the cars, drill down into its hierarchy, and just temporarily turn off its low-res interior, which is the interior we see from the outside, ba-bump, all gone, and we turn on its high-res interior, and then we just take a little peek inside the car. There you can see I've just selected the face of the sat nav, and we can see that this indeed did have the minimap camera material dragged and dropped onto it. So we can see quite easily how we can use this effect for all sorts of things. We could use it for generating a security camera in a first-person shooter game, where we could have a camera up in the sky that was kind of videoing the player as he's walking down a corridor, and then we could have that being rendered to a texture which is then mapped to a monitor screen, for example. We could even, with a little bit of flipping of the scale on the x-axis, we could even use it to make a mirror. But we'll go into that another time. The important thing, though, is that what this allows you to see is how artistic you can be with the minimap. So let's just say, for example, we were making a fantasy RPG game, okay, and we wanted to have a minimap there. Well, we could make the minimap look really artistic rather than just rendering the entire landscape. What you could do instead is, as an offline process, you could take a screenshot of your entire land from a top-down view, just so you get an idea of where everything is supposed to be in real-world terms. Then you could bring that in as a template into Photoshop, for example, and then you could craft a really nice kind of old England kind of, I don't know, Mordor-like map of your land that was really artistic with, fonts and beautiful diagrams. And then you could bring that in as a texture, and then you could just map it to a quad that was stretched to be the entire size of your land. And then what you would see from your minimap camera is you would just be rendering that quad and the player's marker showing you where he is in that map. And as long as the image that you made was the same proportions as the terrain that your land is set on, it would all marry up correctly, and you would see in the minimap a really nice and stylish looking minimap, and also one that would be incredibly quick to render because it would just be an image mapped to a single quad rather than rendering your entire fantasy terrain from top down, which would probably slow your game to a crawl. The last thing I want to talk about is just how we use that render texture in overlay mode, because when we're not in the cockpit view, when we're say in the bonnet view, for example, we no longer have any polygons that we're mapping that material to. In fact, we're using Unity's immediate mode GUI in order to do that. So how do I do that? Well, if you've watched GI Racing 1 videos, I know I keep saying that, but it is important, you will no doubt know that we have this race GUI object in our scene, and this is a pretty big script which is responsible for rendering all of the things like the gauges, the speedometers, and all those sorts of things. And it uses Unity's immediate mode GUI to do that. However, what is important in this discussion is that you'll notice in its inspector, it has a little slot here that allows us to drag in that minimap render texture. And it uses that to use Unity's GUI.draw texture function, so it can just draw that texture directly to the screen. But what it also has is another slot for the minimap overlay, and if I select this asset in my project, you'll see that this is just a transparent texture of the border that I wish to overlay on top of the minimap, so it doesn't just look like a square when it's rendered as an overlay. So I render the minimap first by using Unity's draw texture command, and then I render this overlay on top of it. So the race GUI needs to have references to both of those objects, both the render texture and the overlay that we wish to overlay on the render texture. And if I just open up that script before I go, I can show you the exact lines in the on GUI function where the draw texture command is used to draw the minimap. And here we are, it's this little block of code here, which basically says if this camera has been told to draw the minimap, because we can disable or enable the minimap on a per camera basis, and this camera is not a car interior. Now that's important because we know that if we're inside the car, then we're looking at the cockpit, and we know that the minimap is already being taken care of just by virtue of the fact that the minimap material is mapped to the sat-nav device. But if we're not inside the car, if we're outside the car, then we need to draw it as an overlay. So the first thing it says is, assuming we have a valid reference to that minimap render texture, then we use Unity's GUI.draw texture function, passing in the minimap render texture, and we just pass in the screen coordinates that we would like it to be rendered at. And that's that little bottom left corner here. And then I say, providing we have the minimap overlay graphic, we then call draw texture again, and we draw that on top of the minimap texture that we've just rendered. It's transparent, so the minimap texture shows through underneath, but it puts a nice round border on it so it doesn't look too stark. And that's the good thing about Unity's immediate mode GUI system. Anything that you draw later in the code draws on top of anything that you draw earlier. So you can see, if I press play one final time and go to bonnet cam mode, turn off the rear view mirror. In the middle there you see our minimap texture being drawn that would be drawn as a complete square here, but then what we do to hide the very square edges is we render our rounded border graphic over the top of it. And that, my friends, is our minimap lesson complete. I hope it's been useful. Thanks for listening. I will see you shortly with more cool things and more interesting topics related to GI Racing 2. Bye-bye.